Okay, today I'm going to show you how to take a simple one shot like this and using the techniques covered in this video, transform it into some really cool glitchy chord stabs like this. Now, just like a classic cooking show, I've already got the meal ready to go. If you want to download the finished rack from this video for free, you can just head to my website. The link is in the description. If you want to actually learn and understand what's going on in this rack, you can keep watching. I'll show you how you can make it yourself. So this technique focuses entirely around drum sampler. I have this tendency whenever something new comes out in Ableton Live to use it for the exact opposite of its intended purpose. And so of course when 12.1 came out and they announced a drum sampler, my strongest desire was to try using it with anything but drums. Now what we're going to focus on today is the thing that makes Drum Sampler really unique, which is its effects processing unit. There are a number of different effects type, but to achieve this kind of effect, we're going to focus on the stretch effect built into it. So let's go ahead and open up Live and dive right in, and I'll show you how you can make this for yourself. So let's start off by talking about some of the parameters on Drum Sampler that we are going to be manipulating to achieve these effects. So Drum Sampler has a simplified envelope compared to a normal 4-stage ADSR. We've got an attack, a hold, and a decay. Hold may be the new one for you. Hold simply means the amount of time the sample will maintain peak amplitude once it is reached peak amplitude before entering decay. So, for example, if the hold is set all the way to 0, the sample just immediately starts decaying. But if we bring up hold, it will sustain that amplitude for however long is set here. So with a hold of 60 seconds for a short one shot like this that is barely a second long, it's going to just be loud the whole time, right? Now, some of the parameters that we're going to be manipulating is start and length. But where the magic is really going to happen here is with the effects unit. And there are a number of different effects types, as I said, but we're going to focus primarily on stretch. Stretch has two controls, factor and grain. So factor is just the length of time stretching relative to the original length of the sample. So a factor of 1 means that the sample is just going to play back as recorded. A factor of 2, it's going to take twice as long for that sample to play back. Now you can go all the way up to a factor of 20, which is quite long. I'm going to raise the hold all the way up so that we'll hear the whole sample, and I will play it at different factor lengths for you so that you can hear what we're talking about. So when you get up to a factor of 20, you are doing some serious time stretching there. Now the other control is grain. Grain essentially says we're going to grab a window of the sample this size, and we're going to repeat that any number of times relative to the factor to achieve this time stretching effect. So right at 100 milliseconds, it's relatively smooth. We can go all the way up to 300 milliseconds. Sorry, let me increase the hold. So 300 milliseconds, that's a large window. For context, that is about 1/3 of a second. So it's enough for us to perceive it as a unit of time, despite it being so short. And it sounds very choppy as a result. Now, versus if we go all the way down to 5 milliseconds, that's a really, really small unit of time, right? That is, almost 1,000th of a second, right? 1 second is 1,000 milliseconds. And so 5 milliseconds is very, very short. And as a result, we can't really hear the sample. It's too small of a window to capture any real defined quality of the sample. However, it's got a really kind of cool glitchy effect. And so all of those parameters, coupled with some mainstays like frequency for the filter, as well as some little bit of modulation, we're going to take advantage of to achieve these effects. And hopefully this helps give you a really solid overview before we dive into some of the complex modulation that we're going to be doing. Okay, so I have a simple loop setup of drum sampler just triggering every half measure, C3, which means that it's going to be playing back the sample at its intended pitch, right? Because most samplers in live are tuned to C3 by default. The one exception is slice mode of simpler, which starts on C1 instead. So let's go ahead and listen. Cool sound, but we're not quite to the glitchy effects that we want to be at yet. So to do that, we need to introduce an additional device to this chain, which is LFO. So if you are unfamiliar with it, LFO is one of Live's modulators, which is a really powerful set of devices that allow you to modulate controls on other devices. And Drum Sampler is missing an LFO. It would be a feature that I would love to see added at some point to Drum Sampler, but for now, this external LFO works great. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this LFO to modulate the factor and the grain. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and hit map and map the factor. Now, by default, it's set to modulation mode, which essentially means that we can still control this macro, and the LFO will simply modulate, in this case, plus or minus 50% of that position. Instead, I'm going to click and set it to remote. So I can no longer control factor. The LFO has full control. This allows me to set ranges as needed. And it also, which is ideal, allows me to visualize what's happening. So I am going to just leave the range at 0 to 100, but set the overall depth at this point to 85. So let's listen with just factor modulated. Great, we're starting to get into that glitchy effect ballpark, but I want to control the grain as well via the LFO. So to do that, I need to click this little square in the upper right of LFO, which opens up the additional mapping menu. You can map up to 8 parameters with a single LFO. So I'm going to click map, and I'm going to now map grain. And same as the factor, I'm going to go ahead and hit mod and instead set it to remote. Now, they're both moving perfectly in unison. What I want to do instead actually is invert the movement of the grain size by simply adjusting the range to not go from 0 to 100 like stretch factor, but instead go from 100 to 0. So let's hear this now. Okay, so we are getting some cool glitchy effects, which is great. But next we need to adjust the controls of LFO proper. So the sine wave is really consistent. we don't really want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it to random. And now it'll randomly move the position of both. Now, it's pretty much moving as a square wave. We're getting some cool sounds here already, but I really want to hear that movement. To do that, I need to introduce some smoothness. So I'm just going to add about 45% of smoothness. And now we see that every time it adjusts its position, it is moving to get there. Let's listen. Already achieving some really, really cool effects. Next, I want to switch the rate from being hertz to being a quantized beat sync. And I want to set it to a faster rate. I'm going to set it to an eighth note. Now let's listen. Cool. Okay, we are starting to achieve some results here. But we can go further with it. So what I want to do now is start mapping some other parameters on Drum Sampler. So I'm going to open up this expanded mapping menu again, and I want to map now both the start point and I want to map the length. Now, at this point, it's up to you on whether you want to set it like this or you want to set it with modulation versus remote, right? So we could listen to either. Let's listen to this. Either way, right? Versus mod allows us to set those windows yourself, which depending on the one shot that you're using to create this, if it has a really long tail, you may want to have these set to modulation so that way you can keep the action away from that quiet tail and more towards the transient. And you can, of course, tighten up these ranges. You can, say, I only want it to modulate 25% of each position. Because you got to think, right, even though we set the start time to here, it's modulating beyond and within. Same with the length, which is, relatively common granular behavior. And we're starting now to get some really glitchy effects. Now, at this point, there are some additional effects that you can add to really enhance what's going on here. So, one that I really like adding, you have to be careful with though, is OTT. And I am definitely somebody who prefers Live's stock OTT versus the X-Fur one. But this will just really make these glitches pop. Now you have to be careful because it can add a lot of clicking in the top end, but it sounds really cool. So I'll slowly bring it in as I hit play here. And I'm just going to go ahead and lower the depth as I bring it up so that we're not pushing into the extremes overall. So really, really cool sound. And as I said, it really, as the name implies, it pushes everything coming out of Drum Sampler to this really over-the-top place, which can be really cool for hearing the small rhythms contained within these stuttering glitches. Now, additionally, we can, of course, manipulate the filter in Drum Sampler. And to really kind of add some extra variety, we can grab the velocity device and we can introduce randomness to the incoming velocity of the note. Now, to do this successfully, you want to probably bring down the velocity to volume so that you don't have these random spikes. But we're going to crank up, or in this case down, the velocity to filter, bring up the resonance, and close the filter a bit. So now that the velocity is going to be random, the position of the filter is also going to be randomized. Which can be really cool if you're working with faster notes. Okay, so now that you've created this cool, glitchy sample playback device chain, what do you do with it? Well, first off, you can, of course, make this into a rack. And as I said at the start of the video, I have already made a version of this into a rack. You can go to my website and download it right now for free. But then what do you use the rack for, of course, right? So there's two ways you can go about it. Drum Sampler is a MIDI device, so you can sequence with it. So I've created a short sequence here. The other approach is to resample it and then sequence those new samples that you have created. So for example, I could go ahead and insert a new audio track, and I'm going to go ahead and call it DS for Drum Sampler, resample, and I will set it to listen to track 8, which has the drum sampler, and arm that to record. And so now I could just record these glitches. And depending on the different effects and settings that I have, I could record it multiple times and sequence that together. Now, for the example that I created at the top of this video, I went ahead and did the first method of sequencing it with a lot of small little notes and stuttery rhythms. And then I am automating a whole ton of macros I set up as a part of this rack. So there is a ton that you can do with this to achieve some really cool glitchy chords. As always, thank you so much for watching. Consider, liking, subscribing, leaving a comment. I'm working to grow this channel, and all of that helps. If you want to grab this rack for free, head to the link in the description. And also, check out my weekly newsletter, which I offer advice, techniques, and insights for music producers who want to work professionally in the field. So, till next week, I'll see you then.